This is the first time I'll be doing a channel update, just to kind of discuss briefly what's going on this channel and what some of my plans are, thoughts are on the channel itself. This is an example here on the screen of one of many different diagrams that I created in the course of trying to come to an understanding of what this stuff was about. And this one I still feel has a fair amount of resonance. In the outer band here, we could think of that as Wuji, meaning no distinction. And, you know, maybe that's not the best way of viewing it, because it's unclear whether or not distinction would take place within no distinction. So you could think of Wuji as being outside of fundamental distinction, because that's what this next band is, the fundamental distinction between yin and yang. So here's the single yang line, here's the single yin line. The basics, fundamental distinction, the basic polarity. And I would think of that as being and non-being. That's the basic polarity. The things which are, the things which are not. The presence and the void. You could say the absence, the presence and the absence. The question is, of course, which one is which? And you have to remember that reversal is a huge theme, and that within Taijitsu, within the Taiji symbol, we have this concept of yin turning into yang. And so it's not so clear, like I think most people would think, well, obviously the presence is yang. And the absence is yin, emptiness. Okay, sure, maybe. But of course, the presence is the one which is going through the changes, which is a yielding aspect. And the absence, the thing which is not, is always, in essence, the same. So it's firm. So, you know, whatever. It could be either way, I suppose. I guess the way I have it set up, this is actually the presence, being. And then the yin and yang in dialogue with each other, the diagrams, right, is kind of, it wells up from nothingness and then returns. So the cycle of life and death, you could say, and you know, the way that I've described the diagrams in the past is the interaction between the observer and the observed, or consciousness and phenomena, if you like. And so you have this rising up of consciousness and phenomena, and then descending back into, you could say, well, ignorance and death, right? And that you could say, the prenatal is the way that the mind plays when spirit is ascendant and material is small, Shao yin. This is Shao yang here, the lesser yang. So it's when the yin is lesser, Shao yin, it's not as important as the yang, right? And so you have the prenatal arrangement. But when you're in a materialist zone, then the Tai yin is the context, and the spirit is small, Shao yang, right? And that, of course, would be the postnatal. That's basically the idea. It's a nice summation, actually. Kind of still works. I recently have been getting a lot more subscribers on the channel, which is really wonderful to see. So welcome to those of you who are new here. I don't put a lot of material up here. I think there's a fair amount to think about with what I've already put up here. I have a lot of things that I am working on that I'd like to eventually complete. I don't have a heck of a lot of time to work on it. And I recognize that in order to have a successful YouTube channel, you probably would want to post things like at least once a week. So I'm really not doing a great job when it comes to a business model here, that's for sure. But nevertheless, I'm not really motivated by business, not being an independently wealthy person and not having a lot of free time in my hands. I am slow in producing content. So if any of you want to hasten that process, you can always do the subscription thing on Patreon or Substack. That would help move things along for sure. I also think it might be worth kind of framing some of the content in a basic philosophical approach. Like, you'll notice that pretty much all I discuss on this channel is the Bagua, the Trigram, and associated concepts within, you could say, Taoism or Chinese philosophy or what have you. And I also focus on, I have a few videos about the natal chart, which you might call a horoscope, and some people would refer to as astrology, even though I think that's a terrible word for it. And, you know, it might not seem as if these systems have much in common, and in some senses they don't. I probably should spend a bit more time with, for instance, the Chinese astrology system, which is definitely more integrated with, well, five-element theory, for instance. But in essence, I see these as a lens through which to view things, and as extraordinarily helpful, but they are just fundamentally symbolic systems. And so the question, the degree to which a symbolic system is really helpful, I think, is an open question. I would say that, like most tools, they're helpful in the right circumstances and very unhelpful in the wrong circumstances, or useless. But at times, I think if you're trying to use them for the wrong things, it can really be, well, dangerous, ultimately. So the question is, well, what are these systems for? Now, in the case of the Bagua and the Trigram, my sense of it is that it's a system designed to help you get your mind straight, to understand what the mind is about, what it's doing, and to get a sense of what its functionality is, what the possibilities are, and how to get some degree of control over it, and to see things in a more beneficial way, in a way that will ease your suffering and perhaps help one make better decisions. And ultimately, that was always my sense of things, that, you know, I spent many, many years dissatisfied with my own perspective on things, and I recognized that I could not make sense out of the world in a way that seemed helpful, and I was constantly ending up in similar situations that were not good. There just wasn't a sense of forward progression. There wasn't a sense that I was making the most out of life. And through a long series of bizarre occurrences, you know, the first one really was that my father gave me a copy of the I Ching, which was not the kind of thing that he ever did before or since. It was just completely out of the blue. He would often give me a book for my birthday, but more often than not, it was a book that I wasn't that interested in, honestly. Sometimes it would be something vaguely scientific, kind of popular scientific, I guess you could say. Sometimes it would be health-related. Why it is that he gave me a copy of the I Ching, I'll never know. And I didn't know what to make of it at all. I guess in some sense you could say I still don't know what to make of the I Ching. And so far I haven't spent a heck of a lot of time on this channel talking about the I Ching. At a certain point I figured, well, if it's the case that the trigrams are the constituent components of the I Ching, and it does seem as if they are, well, then it would make sense to understand the trigrams first. And I do have a pretty good sense of what the I Ching is about now on some level, or at least, let's say, using the model that I've proposed for the trigram, I have a good way of interpreting the I Ching without referring to an I Ching text. And that was one of the things that really got me after a while, because I collected a lot of different versions of the I Ching, because I couldn't make sense out of the one that I got, and the one that my dad gave me was the old classic, Wilhelm. I think the next one I got was by Hua Qing Ni, and actually I have a whole stack right here. because I recently did an I Ching reading for someone, and it's kind of nice to just sort of take a look at what others have said when you're examining a hexagram. So even though I have my own way of interpreting them, I do find it fascinating still to refer to these other texts. But my God, the differences between the interpretations are pretty extraordinary at times. So it typically just ends up being very confusing if you refer to all the different texts. It can be interesting. I mean, in some respects, you could say confusion is a natural part of the learning process. So I have the Taoist I Ching, which is a translation by Thomas Cleary of Liu Yiming. I'm sure I'm saying the Chinese, I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly, so please forgive me for that. It's a very interesting, somewhat mystical translation. I mean, it's a mystical translation of a mystical thing to begin with. And then I have, Alfred Huang and Henry Wei. Those are the ones I have right here. I may have a couple others around somewhere, but ultimately, while I do find them interesting, I find them dissatisfying. And maybe it's my, rationalistic Western mind that insists on there being some kind of fundamental underlying reason for a symbolic system. But I will say that I believe that the understanding that's arisen from this new way of looking at things is incredibly helpful and quite clear. And it seems like a few people at least agree that this is a worthy effort. And so I just wanted to make a little, video saying thanks to those of you who are joining the channel. Oh, and the other thing I was thinking about is moving to another platform, because it is pretty clear that YouTube has become they've decided that it's okay for them to censor things, and it's not like they're censoring a lot of the horrible stuff that's on there. They're censoring scientists and medical professionals who have a different idea about what's going on. Like people who have really studied issues and have worthwhile things to say that the public might really benefit from hearing, but because it's not what the official line is by the various governmental agencies and whoever it is who's making the decisions now, YouTube thinks it's within their right to just take them down. So I find that, disturbing and Orwellian, and I don't really like the idea of spending a lot of energy to develop my presence on this platform. So I'm considering a move. I don't know. I don't really know where to go. Rumble or Odyssey, or I don't know. If anyone has any thoughts along those lines, any expertise, because I don't really know that much about it anymore. I just don't follow the tech world too closely. So I've done a little bit of research, but so far I have no clear direction. And I have noticed that Odyssey doesn't seem to work very well here, but that doesn't mean much because we have crap internet here. And, Rumble maybe works a little better, but it's definitely, unfortunately, YouTube works great here. So it's a bit of a dilemma. Anyway, so another thing I was kind of thinking about and wondering, for those of you who care about these issues and are interested in following the channel, if you have any input along those lines, I'd love to hear about it. I think that basically covers everything I was thinking about. So I'll try to have, I do have about a dozen videos that are somewhere between 20 to 80% completed on various subjects related to this channel. So I will try to release something within the next few weeks, hopefully. But I'll probably be limited, as I have been in the past, to a release every few months. I think I'm probably doing about a video every 3 or 4 months on this channel. I'd love to be able to do it more often, but it would require a level of support that I honestly don't expect. unless there's someone out there who has a real patron type of impulse and this is of a particular interest to them and they'd really like to see it developed, you never know. There may be someone out there at some point with that kind of financial resource. Otherwise, it'll just be, tips in the jar from time to time. Every now and then someone sends me a little bit of PayPal or something like that. And I do have a few patrons which on Patreon and a few subscribers on Substack now too, which is really nice. So it's really great to know that people are willing to support this effort, although it really doesn't amount to more than a few $100 a year, really, at this point. I think I'm getting somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 a year from these efforts. So it ain't nothing, and that's good. So it ain't nothing, and that's something. I never expected any of this to happen. I wasn't planning on thinking about these things in the same way I wasn't planning on getting that book from my dad. It just kind of like took on a life of its own, and I did get obsessed with it. At a certain point, I just felt like, okay, I've got to come up with some kind of an understanding about it, because as I was saying earlier, I felt that I couldn't get my orientation in this world. And so, in essence, what eventually happened is that I realized that the Bagua, if you take the Trigram as being a representation of a mind state, the Bagua was a description of a way of organizing mind states, or that the two, and there's actually a third arrangement of the Bagua, which I'm going to talk about at some point or another, which they call I think it's referred to as the mid-heaven arrangement. You don't often see it. It's very rare. I haven't spent a lot of time with it, but I do plan on discussing it a little bit. But these other two arrangements, I noticed that they correlated with a lot of the ideas that I was reading about in particular in some Taoist texts and in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, these are all very deeply interwoven traditions. There were certain ideas that were elemental within a spiritual understanding of that time. So it would make sense that this would be a codification of some of that insight. And I do believe that is essentially what's being described. And so all of this, again, just to kind of circle around back to where I started this question about symbolic systems, they're not that useful if you just are trying to figure out the symbol. You have to get the symbol to be an experiential phenomena. You have to dispense with the symbol once you recognize what it symbolizes, and you have to stick with the thing that it symbolizes and forget about the symbol. There's a beautiful passage in Cheng Po Chuan's Understanding Reality where he discusses that. He says something along the lines of, once the meaning of the hexagram is understood, then forget about the lines. Something along those lines. It's absolutely true. And so, there's another beautiful thing that said, I think it's Zen Master Foyen, says there's only two types of sickness in this world. One is going in search of a donkey while riding on a donkey. And the other one is refusing to get off the donkey once you've found the donkey. And so you could say that the thing that we're looking for is not in the symbol. It's what the symbol symbolizes. Now, if you find what the symbol symbolizes and you're still clinging to the symbol, that's called refusing to get off the donkey once you found the donkey. Now, in a certain sense, you could say that we're always riding on this donkey, and that's why the first disease is going in search of a donkey while riding on a donkey. Because fundamentally, the observation it's available to all of us. We're having an experience. We can notice our minds, and we can notice what happens as a result of the patterns in our mind. Now, do we need to be told about it? Well, I did. I don't know if I ever would have found out about any of this stuff if I hadn't started listening to Alan Watts in my 20s, and then just kind of branching out from there to all sorts of different ideas, and eventually starting to get a little sense about what it would mean to experientially practice some of the things that were being discussed, because they were just ideas for a long time. So I think it's a good idea to keep this in mind. The same is true when it comes to the natal chart. Some people get very attached to, let's say, astrology. I don't like the word, but it's a good kind of people do get attached to this astrological stuff, to their horoscopes and what have you, and they seek to kind of find guidance on a regular basis, depending upon, like, quite often the transits. They'll say, okay, well, is Mercury in retrograde and blah, 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 and all that, I don't think that's a great way of doing things. You don't want to have to look at a chart in order to make a decision. Now, from time to time, it might be helpful to do so, but you don't want to rely on that. You want to be able to sort of have the competency to make a decision at any given moment. And so knowing yourself would be helpful in getting to that point where you're able to make that decision, and the chart can be a way of giving you insight into yourself so you understand. But do you need to remember all the things that are said? Not necessarily. I know some people who remember every detail about their chart. I don't even remember my chart very well. And I've looked at hundreds of charts now. I don't think it's worth remembering these things. I think it's useful at critical junctures when you have a little bit of time to reflect. It's a way of getting perspective, of seeing something new that you didn't see before. And it can be very useful that way, because otherwise you're left to your own devices entirely to figure out something new, or you're going to rely on someone else to make an observation. And good Lord, I mean, occasionally there are people who make great observations, right? But I'd say there's not a lot of them. There are some, and maybe some people will make occasionally useful remarks. But if you're at a point where you really need some guidance and you turn to the wrong person, it can be absolutely devastating. So there's something wonderfully neutral about a symbolic system to turn to. Now, I know a lot of rationalists would scoff at this notion because they can't see that a symbolic system would have a necessary relationship with the way things actually function. But I would say, well, ultimately language is a symbolic system, and that's what we all use to try to make sense out of the world. And so the extent to which our language has something to do with reality is the extent to which we can make sense out of the world. And, our languages have gotten incredibly complicated and kind of convoluted, and they may no longer be adequate systems for dealing with the world. And then you have something as vast as mathematics, which, if you're going to talk about it just in general, whether or not mathematics has anything to do with the reality of the world is also very much up for grabs. A lot of people will say, well, mathematics is the language of nature. Well, where's the evidence for that? Because you can occasionally come up with a formula that seems to correspond to something in nature. If it were the case that mathematics were actually the language of nature, the language that nature speaks, well, then every mathematical expression, every true mathematical expression, would also be true in nature. And that's obviously not the case. There's all kinds of mathematics that we have no necessary correlate within the natural world. So that symbolic system is also somewhat questionable when it comes to, if you're going to just take mathematics writ large and say, okay, well, that's a rigorous system for describing the world and coming to an understanding of things. I don't see why that would be the case. And so a simple system, like the trigram, like the Bagua, even the hexagram, which is way more complicated, it's still only 64 different hexagrams, although there are, the potential, you could basically say, of 4,096 different hexagrams because you have the moving lines. But that's still a relatively simple lexicon. So is nature fundamentally simple or fundamentally complex? Ken Wheeler would say that it's simplex, which means it has simple elements that produce a wide range of complex outcomes. And I tend to think that's probably true. I mean, indeed, that would be what science would have us think as well. You have 100 and some odd elements, chemically speaking. You have a limited number of quarks and particles that are supposedly the constituent components of matter. And so it does seem that in general there's an agreement that nature operates on the basis of some very elemental and a relatively small number of elemental particles and elemental parts. Now, whether or not the particle is the actual model, I think Wheeler, of course, would say no, it isn't. That's not what's that question here. The question is, well, what do we do with symbolic systems, and to what extent do these symbolic systems correlate with reality? The basic message, I'm sorry I've gotten kind of long-winded here. I know I thought I was done about 20 minutes ago, but the basic message is what you do with a symbolic system is you try and figure out what it symbolizes, and then you dispose of the symbolic system like you get off the donkey once you find the donkey, because you don't need to spend your life searching for a donkey that you're already riding. All you need is the understanding that there is the donkey right there between your legs. Then you can get off it. The donkey isn't there anymore. You're no longer riding it. Or you're no longer being carried around by a donkey. And the extent to which a symbolic system correlates with reality, well, it's only symbolizing reality. So it never really is reality. I would say that ultimately symbolic systems are a path away from reality. But we've gotten to the point now where we are such a symbolic creature, so deeply immersed in our language, that we need symbolic systems in order to help us back to reality. That's why I think Cheng-Po Chuan wrote the book Understanding Reality. And I'm not trying to put myself in his league whatsoever, but I'm doing my little part here as well in an effort to, well, not only offer a pathway back to reality to others, but also to more firmly establish my own understanding of things. Because quite often, I've been operating in somewhat of a vacuum. Occasional moments of discussion with others about these things, but mostly on my own without a lot of feedback on it. And so putting it out there helps me to refine my own practice, my own understanding of things. I get challenged from time to time, which is always good. And so, in essence, it's like testing the whole thing to see whether it's real, whether it works. Okay, that's it. And we'll catch you on the next one.